Now, I'm delighted to introduce our next session. I know Rolls-Royce doesn't need many introductions, but I will just set a little bit of context because I'm not sure everyone appreciates the full extent and all the different things that Rolls-Royce engages with. So, as everyone will know, Rolls-Royce operates in some of the most difficult parts of the global economy to decarbonize. That's transport, that's the built environment, and that's power generation. These are all hard to abate sectors. Rolls-Royce engines power trains, off-road trucks, ships, submarines, and other naval vessels, and fighter jets. They provide continuous and emergency power for data centers, hospitals, and remote communities. And you may also have seen that Rolls-Royce has just announced its move into nuclear power generation as well. But Rolls-Royce is probably best known for the provider of jet engines for planes. In fact, they power almost half of the world's long-haul aircraft. And it is the only company in the aerospace and defense sector that's in the UN's race for zero. So with that context and the enormity of what's being addressed here, today we're joined by Sir Ian Davis, who after 9 years as chairman at the helm of Rolls-Royce has just stepped down a few weeks ago, and the head of sustainability, Rachael Everard. Rachael, delighted to welcome you. I know you're fresh from Glasgow and COP26, so delighted to have you with us. And I know you'll both be talking about how Rolls-Royce is aligning with net zero in this very, very, very challenging sector and playing your part in combating climate change as one of probably the most important leaders in this category. So after your session, we'll open up to Q&A. Really looking forward to hearing from you. And again, Rachael, welcome. Delighted to have you with us. And Ian, thank you again for joining us on our summit. Over to you, Rachael.
Thanks, Sandra. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today and have the opportunity to chat with Ian as well. So thank you. I want to start actually, and you mentioned, Sandra, Ian's tenure at Rolls-Royce, which has been fantastic, and I've enjoyed being a small part of that. But Ian, you have personally, as part of the chair of the board, championed sustainability and helped unlock doors for me and what we're trying to do at Rolls-Royce, and been a big part of our net zero carbon commitment. So I wanted to start with, what do you think is the role of the board in promoting sustainability, and how can the board vision and the role of the board help our leadership to move beyond kind of short term to look at the longer term existential opportunities that sustainability and climate change bring about?
Well, thanks for the question, and hello everyone. I'm delighted to join this ECHO conference. Just the role of the board in sustainability. Well, I see sustainability and climate change as like any mega trend. It is a mega trend. It's an unalterable trend. I think, Rachel, you and I started talking about this 7 or 8 years ago as something that was going to fundamentally reshape our industries. I think it's now going to reshape this. Obvious it's going to reshape the world. I think really the role of the board in relation to this mega trend is like it is for any mega trend. I would say the same for social media or technology, and that's to ask the questions, probe. And boards can't have visions that are different from the management. In the end, management are the ones that drive strategies and make them happen. But I think what boards can do is to keep challenging, are we moving fast enough? Have we embraced the impact of it? And particularly as at Rolls-Royce, you've got a board consisting of many people who come from different aspects of industry, all variously affected by climate change. So to me, the role of the board is exactly as it would be for any major ground shaping trend, making sure that the company is positioned to deal with it. And Rachel, as you know, that's something you and I have been working on now for 8 years.
Scary that it's been so long coming, but I think we've seen, and we just heard actually in the last closing minutes of the previous presentation about the real momentum over the last couple of years in particular, and around corporate climate action. And I'm particularly proud that during that time frame, Rolls-Royce has made its own net zero carbon commitment, and as Sandra mentioned, joined the Race to Zero campaign. And that's something that the sustainability team, our leadership team, and the board almost worked on together, I think, Ian.
Mm. Yeah, well, we did. I mean, sustainability, there are many sectors where what's called sustainability, but in this case, environmental sustainability, there are other aspects of sustainability which we mustn't get. It's so integral to the strategy of the company. If you're in a really high profile sector like oil and gas or aerospace engines or beef, where the impact on climate change, it's so central to the strategy that it is something where the management and the board work together. I would just say, you said we've been very active, Rachel, in this. We have, but like many companies, the activism still and some of the NGO spot on this is more in words and policies than reactions. And one of the huge challenges that we have and many in industry have is having policies and commitments is crucial. And I think the progress we've made in the last 2 years has been stunning, but nevertheless, this is going to take time. There is no way you can just move from having engines on planes unless you stop flying completely, which is what some people think should happen. But if you take that, or unless you stop digging oil and gas out, or unless you stop eating beef, go on, this is going to take a very significant time. So the transition, and the word transition is all businesses is really, really important. And I think this is why the communications community has a huge role to play, because the announcements at COP, the announcement of policies is great and it's necessary, but there's now going to be quite a time period to actually turn this into reality. And so to me, the real public relations, communications, governmental link is really going to happen over the next 10 to 15 years, particularly in what you've called, Rachel and Sandra, hard to abate industries like aerospace engines. If you're on the other side of the fence, as we are with nuclear, if that happens, then the narrative is completely different. But I think managing this difficult period between policies, words, investment in technologies, and billions and trillions are going into it now, and actual outcomes is going to be a danger period. And that for sure will be exploited by the many groups that want us to go faster, or frankly, some of them I think don't really want it to happen actually, because there are other agendas at play. So to me, it's still all just beginning when it comes to implementation and managing the different constituencies that are impacted.
Yeah, absolutely right, Ian. And I think you mentioned the word transition there. Do you think there's a question of timing? Rolls-Royce became very vocal in this space a couple of years ago, as you just referenced. But I think in the past, perhaps we'd have been a bit more concerned maybe around owning up to the size of the problem or the size of the challenge ahead of us. And I think we have really seen a shift in corporate transparency and trust and being open about the challenges we face and the opportunities as well that lie ahead. How do you think for organizations just starting out on this journey can take those first steps?
Well, I think, clarity, I think it's very important for all organizations to define where it stands on the environmental, I'll focus on environmental sustainability, Rachel, the environmental sustainability spectrum. There are some companies that I think quite legitimately should be focusing on, with integrity, ticking the boxes. They don't need to do more than that. It's not going to make much difference. It's very important not to be a bad actor on environmental sustainability, but the ability for many industries and companies to actually influence the outcome on climate change environment is quite small. And so I don't think all companies should suddenly become sort of manic net zeros. I think there needs to be a very thoughtful approach. If on the other hand, you're at the center of it, like Rolls-Royce is, like many industry sectors are, you have to have a very, very active statement of where you stand. And active statements of where you stand means nothing these days unless you've got transparency of data, of measures, of intent, and on milestones. And transparency is a very dangerous word and it's much abused. We could talk about that. But in this case, I think unless you back up your statements with intents and milestones and honesty, and Rachel, in the aerospace sector of Rolls-Royce, as compared to, say, some of our power systems, which is providing static power, for example, to data centers, the timeframes are completely different. It is almost inconceivable that large jet engines can be powered by fundamentally new forms of green technology for 20 years. It's very possible that large swathes of the economy in the world, as I said, data centers, cities, heating, they can do it in 5 years. So I think managing the timeframes, making it clear why it cannot be too fast or it can be faster, I think is a very, very important part of the transparency equation. And the transparency will lead to attack and hostility for sure, as well as, I think, positive response too. But my key point is managing the timing and not getting caught up in this fashion. There's a bit of fashion about this too, which I think is dangerous, but being very thoughtful, very purposeful, to me, it's just like a major strategic trend. I would say the same about adoption of technology or digital for certain industries as well. And I think to treat it as a major strategic theme and action, I think declutters a lot of some of the myths that are really building up around the whole topic.
As Sandra mentioned, I've just come from Glasgow last week, of the last 2 weeks, COP26, and it was very apparent, I just muted my computer, very apparent that the focus was on urgency of action, and regardless of whether or not the conclusions that came out of the formal negotiations are urgent enough, it was written clearly on the wall in COP, in the zone I was in, the time is now. So I think for hard to abate sectors that are facing quite a drastic challenge, or radical transformation as the title of this segment is, there are, as you said, Ian, there are some areas that will be hard and slow to decarbonise and to abate, and we have to face as a society as well as an individual company, I think, difficult choices about what we prioritise. But there are actions we can take in the short term, and I think an important part for any organisation is mapping out their total emissions footprint, focusing on what's the quick wins, the low-hanging fruit, and what is also requires that longer-term strategic evolution.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I'm still digesting, and maybe Rachel, you'll help us all understand, what actually came out of COP. But my view is that the top themes and the tone of COP was excellent, in that there's a recognition that some things will take time to transition. And we must remember that climate change, environment is probably the single biggest issue facing the planet, but it's not the only one. So if we move much too quickly, for example, on oil and gas and coal, we could throw 25% of the world into extreme poverty very quickly. And that will probably have a worse impact on the world, migration and all the rest of it, than that. So I think the transition point is really important. I think the urgency point is important. I'm incredibly impressed. And to me, one of the good things coming out of COP was the presence of the finance and the business sectors at COP. I see as a good thing. If we've learned one thing from COVID, when you get industry and finance and governments and academia working together, almost impossible to solve problems become solvable. I've been heavily involved in the vaccine development. I'm on the board of Johnson & Johnson. We've been at that. And to watch a collaboration between groups that historically it didn't always find it easy to work together. It's just stunning what you can achieve. And having business and finance, and I hope that the other groups, NGOs, won't treat them as pariahs, because if business and finance is not there, we will not solve this quickly. Yes, we need the academics. Absolutely, we need the technology. Absolutely, we need the legitimacy that NGOs bring. But if we can get that collaboration, I think this could go a lot quicker in some areas than people think. And I use the COVID vaccine as an example. If you'd asked anybody in healthcare 5 years ago that you could develop and launch a vaccine, I know corners were cut, I know risks were taken, in 2 years, they'd have laughed at you. It's just not possible. So I think a lot of this might go faster than people think. And there's an awful lot that we can do that will have a huge impact quite quickly without massive injections of money. Consumption waste is huge. If you look at the environmental impact of Japan, same standards of living, 40% less consumption per capita, methane emission control, deforestation, stopping. These things can be done with a will quite quickly. You don't need to spend trillions on new technologies or completely distort economies and whole societies to get there. So I think we need to segment the problem into those things that can and should be done quickly, by which I mean the next 10 years. Those things that cannot be done quickly without causing huge adverse disruption, particularly economic, not only economic, but also sociological and migration. And I think, we're now forecasting a temperature change, which is not the 2% everyone wants, but they were forecasting 3.6. It's now coming down already, and I see that as a very encouraging sign. So I think we've got a good chance. Once you get all the groups collaborating, the lesson of history is that the pace of change happens faster than people think, not slower.
Yeah, I must admit that was my overwhelming impression of COP, was actually the diversity of voices in the room. At the own panel discussions that I was part of, there was representations from academia, from corporates, from governments, from NGOs, Extinction Rebellion and others that you wouldn't expect to all be sat at a table collaborating on solutions. And I think that was fantastic. And I absolutely agree with you, Ian. The commitments that have come out of COP around methane deforestation are examples. The Glasgow Climate Finance Alliance, these are all business and government coalitions essentially coming together. And I do see that that's having huge traction in
I
taking
think
action.
that's right. And if I have one plea, I don't know if there are any academics here, but if we could reorient the academic community a bit from diagnosis and predicting the end of the world to say, we get it. And I think business gets it. And those that don't never will, so don't worry about them. But all of business, all of banks gets the importance of this. And they know that they have to respond to their constituency. If we could move the academic community in particular from problem diagnosis and predicting the end of the planet to what are the solutions to it, I think that will massively help as well. And again, I cite vaccines. When we move from epidemiological predictions of disaster and 500 million people dying to how are we going to fix this, it made a huge difference. So we need to get everybody moving from just talking about diagnosis of problems and predictions of Armageddon to purposeful problem solving. And that, as you know, Rachel, that's what we've been trying to do at Rolls-Royce through a very, very difficult period in the company.
Yeah. And Ian, actually, that leads me on really nicely to my next question, which was really, how important do you think stakeholder views and perspectives are to an organisation trying to take action on a net zero journey or a sustainability journey more broadly?
I think they're absolutely crucial. The days of the only stakeholder that matters being the shareholder are gone. And by the way, shareholders represent stakeholders themselves. You know, the shareholders are agents for people's pensions. So I think it's absolutely crucial to look at the different stakeholders, society at large. I think for many big companies, and people on this call will know better than I do, the actual talent within your organization is absolutely important as well. And you know, Rachel, that the young engineer is not just a young engineer. By the way, people say it's young, old. It doesn't split like that at all. A lot of older people are very passionate about environmental impact. You know, the pressure from inside organizations is huge. You will not be able to attract the best talent into organization unless you're being responsible. And I think investors get it as well. You can question their motives, and some do, okay, but I don't. I think most investors absolutely see this is an existential problem. And also many of us see it's also a huge opportunity as well. I mean, Rachel, we've talked about this. I mean, climate change, environmental emissions is having a huge impact on our business, but it's creating a demand for new power. And that's, you know, that's going to be a massive opportunity too. So yeah, you have to look at all stakeholders. The days of looking at one or other stakeholder only, I think, are long gone.
Yeah, absolutely. At Rolls, we talk about it as both a societal imperative, a business imperative, but also a massive commercial opportunity. So, and I'd also agree on the role of your employees as well. Just the coverage we've had over the last few weeks in terms of talking about what we've been doing at COP and sharing that with our people has been amongst the most read and well received internal communications we've done throughout the year. So which is fantastic and just shows the kind of energy and appetite, I think, for corporate engagement on this topic.
But you also need to be sensitive. You still have to justify, you know, how can you justify keeping these engines flying? Because whilst Rolls is absolutely committed to, you know, exploiting the opportunities as well as the social imperative of the new economy climate, we're also flying the planes, and you have to explain to employees why, you know, that's not just harmful. It's harmful in one sense, but it also plays a big role in the economy. And when people understand what's going on in China and India, and as you know, they're getting a huge amount of flack for keeping coal open, but people don't realize in both countries, the lights are going out right now because they don't have enough power. And, you know, we can lecture them, you know, on not doing things. And you always need to think as a business person, not just about one topic, in this case, environmental impact. It's hugely important, but, you know, the economic health of particularly the developing world, which are hugely dependent on energy. Typically 15 to 20% of a developing country's economy is linked to energy prices. So if prices go up by 50%, which they are now, it has a massive impact on their economies. And those of you that go to Mauritius or Bali or St. Lucia on holiday, you also know how these economies depend on tourism as well. So we've got to balance this transition so that we make real progress on the issue, but don't destroy everything in the process as well.
Yeah, I think that's where we need to think holistically about sustainability. So we're not just concentrating
on
one.
And that's why sustainability is bigger than climate change.
Absolutely.
Sustainability is a much bigger, and that again, a board I think has a role to challenge management. You know, what are the impacts of this on other aspects of society and societies? I do worry that the West looks at climate change in particular through Western eyes. It's very instructive to travel around China and India, the rural areas, and see what climate change means. I'll just give an example. If the price of coal in India goes up in rural areas by 10%, people stop buying it and they use wood, which is by far a worse impact on the climate than burning coal. So, we need to understand the micro as well as the macro if we're going to really optimize for the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one final question, I think, before we open up for Q&A, really, which is just to ask for your reflections on your 9 years at Rolls-Royce. How do you feel, or what's your kind of proudest moment in terms of how you've personally helped to move forward Rolls-Royce in its journey to net zero?
Well, I'm not sure if it's for me to comment on that, Rachel, perhaps others. And, my 9 years have been dominated by other issues of climate change. I think the one thing I feel good about, we'll see if it pays off. And in the end, when you're chairman of a large company with very long cycles, you look at everything, I'll be looking in 10 years' time to see, is one, I think we were quite early in, Rachel, onto sustainability and climate and acknowledged it as an issue rather than try to avoid it or be defensive. And I'm very pleased that through our various crises, and everyone on this call will probably be aware we've had more than our share of crises, we did keep our R&D investment going, despite quite a bit of financial pressure not to. And much of that was devoted to new technologies such as nuclear, electric, and sustainable fuels. So we'll see if that pays off. It's one thing to invest in the right things. It's another thing for those investments to actually work. SMRs, small modular reactors, is one that's topical at the moment. But I just hope, and I have a feeling, but I'm hopeful that big decision to commit to that R&D investment in new technologies, not just the old technologies which are linked to the sustainability agenda, not just in aerospace, but in installed power and other forms of power, will pay off. This is all 10 to 20 year stuff. It's a very long cycle business. Some of you work in short cycle businesses, and so you'll be looking at different time frames, and I'm very aware of that. But let's see what happens in 10 or 20 years. But I hope and I believe that the company could be quite well positioned against the emerging market and environmental trends.
Thanks, Ian. I think we're opening up for questions now, Sandra.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both. Great questions, Rachel, and great to have your experience in this conversation. And Ian, thank you so much. So much to take out of that, I think, for all of us. There are a lot of questions, as we had with our first session as well, but we have a bit more time, which hopefully we can get into 2 or 3 of them. What I'd probably like to do is ask Nick Archer to unmute himself, and I know you've got a couple of questions, Nick, and then perhaps Jan Dowman, Jan after Nick, if that's okay. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Sandra, and Ian, Rachel, fantastic discussion. Thank you for it. 2 questions, if I may. Ian, how long ago did you actually manage to get institutional investors on board with your abatement strategy? When did they start smelling the coffee? And Rachel, perhaps I could ask you to comment on, because I think you've got a tick in the box on institutional investors now, but what about Gen Z? And do they believe where you're headed is right and fast enough as well? Thank you.
Shall I have a go at that, Rachel, first? Or?
Yeah, fire over the first question, Ian.
It's a very good question about institutional investors, and it's quite difficult, Nick, for me to answer the question because we had so many other issues going on at the time that they were more interested in the liquidity of the company and various other issues. And I would say that the whole climate change agenda didn't really come up with me until about three years ago. We were committing to it about 7 years ago, and there were questions about why our R&D expenditure was not coming down faster. So the question 7 or 8 years ago from the investors that I spoke to was more about why aren't you doing more to reduce rather than why aren't you doing more on environment. But in the last 3 years, it's changed completely. Mostly, though, they ask it, the thing is this a sector I should be investing in at all? This is a hard to abate sector. You've got that with so many sectors. You know, the investors that are most sensitive to climate change are avoiding energy intensive industries, whether it's agriculture, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's engines, you name it. So it's hard to answer holistically. The ones who talk to us, who I think are more balanced, I think the investors that are just not investing in industries because they or their employees don't like it are storing up huge problems. So I'm a big fan of what BlackRock is saying. I think we've got to be very responsible about, there's a lot going on here. And particularly when you've been to emerging economies and you see how dependent they are on energy and carbon energy, they can't just go there. So it does depend on which, and I would say the investors are segmenting quite radically. What the balanced ones, so the ones who really only care about cash flow, they're still in the, and then there are ones who have really, bought into it and they just want nothing to do with carbon industries, so they're avoiding it, which in my view is not helping solve the problem at all. We need investors and companies and NGOs and governments to work together to solve the problem, not to avoid it. So that's that. Gen Z, again, it's probably the same. Gen Z who's really keen on this probably wouldn't, their first thought probably wouldn't be to go and work for Shell or for Rolls-Royce. I mean, let's be honest about it. I think it's a shame. And one of the things we're trying to do is say what we're doing on nuclear, what we're doing on electrical, what we're doing in sustainable fuels. And we've got to get the story about, don't look at what we're doing, look at what we want to do and be part of it. So I would say our challenge to Gen Z, and we've got most of the young Rolls-Royce, brilliant. We've got so many brilliant engineers for whom AI and big data has been second nature for 10 years. They get all this stuff. It's to say, be part of the future, not critics of the present. And that's the message I think we're trying to take. But it's a 10-year year. We've got to navigate this valley of death period between the rhetoric and reality. But a lot of our research engineers are really excited to be working on new technologies that will solve the problem. And as I said, if I have one overall thought, I hope we can move into problem solving, not problem diagnosing or toga rending on a massive scale.
Just if I quickly add to what Ian said there, I absolutely agree with that. I think people want to be part of the solution, but I think they also are looking holistically at the company they choose to work for. And one of the things we're really conscious of is not just helping them in the roles that they perform at Rolls-Royce to make sure they're part of the solution, but actually that our entire kind of package and culture of the organization is sustainable. And that's increasingly part of the kind of conversations that we're having as part of our recruitment process, part of our talent management and attraction and retention, is actually people wanting to work for a company that fits with their personal values increasingly. So that's something that we are actively promoting and trying to do more on. One of the things, sorry, just to add as well, one of my favorite group of people I spoke to at COP actually was a group of younger people than me who were all there campaigning for why net zero needs nuclear, and the energy of this fantastic group of young people that were running around the blue zone for the whole 2 weeks with banners and signs and handing out all sorts of fantastic things was just so engaging. So the debates they were having across COP was fantastic. I think they were a great role model.
What a difference a couple of years makes, and a little bit more understanding. Yes. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Ian, for that. Jan, I think perhaps Rian's addressed part of your question, but please raise your questions and your observation. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for those fascinating insights. Coming from a truly major national champion, it's very important that we really take them into account. I'm a huge fan of hydrogen and nuclear, hence my questions. So the first question is, what are the prospects, if any, of using hydrogen as a fuel for aircraft engines in this future that we're discussing? And the second is really exciting, this announcement about the small nuclear reactors. How long do you think it will take Rolls-Royce to get that technology to scale so that it can be internationally applied?
Well, I'll have a go at that. Firstly, hydrogen on planes. I think our view is that hydrogen fuels will be used on very small planes. 5 to 10-seater taxis. So if you want to fly from Hazelmere to Newquay, I think you might, and you're not going by train. I think it will be within 15 years. Flying electric will be possible. the physics of hydrogen for large engines are very, very complicated. So the theoretical problems have not even been solved for large engines. So I think hydrogen for very large engines, I'll never say never, because one thing we've all learned in the last 50 years that technology never ceases to amaze you. But the physics of hydrogen and electrical, by the way, for large engines is extreme. And I'm talking about long distance engines. If you're flying 200 people for more than 1,000 miles, it's very, very difficult. I won't go into the technical reasons on this call, but it's a very, very difficult one. So we think that for longer haul flight and perhaps medium, working on the fuel side, having non-carbon fuels, what we call sustainable aviation fuels is likely to be the solution in a foreseeable period of time. We're working very closely with the likes of BP and Shell on developing these fuels which don't burn carbon. And there are ways of doing that. The technology is understood there. The cost is horrendous. The investment is horrendous, and you need a lot of energy to create them as well. So one of the problems with decarbonizing energy is it creates a lot of energy to decarbonize everything. It's one of the ironies. So I think that will be tricky. The other thing with planes, remember that safety is incredibly important in planes, and getting certificates. It's one thing to have the technology, it's another thing to have them certified and safe. And liquid hydrogen is not the easiest of things to have going around. So safety, which in my view, the markets are not talking enough when they're talking about these new technologies. They're talking all about the technology. They're not talking about the safety and the certification of applying those technologies when hundreds of millions of people are using it. It's like vaccines. You cannot take chances on this stuff. So I hope that gives you a feel for hydrogen. Hydrogen will come. It will certainly come in static power. I think our power systems business, which is based in Germany, hydrogen will be a very important part of it. I think a lot of houses, data centers, others will be using hydrogen and electric, but for actual aerospace, I think it'll be less so. So I think parts of the power grid will lend itself to hydrogen, but it'll usually be on land, and it won't be involved with mobility. SMRs, just quickly, sorry, I hope I'm not banging on, Sandra, too long, but just to answer the question. The technology is not new. One of the advantages we think, and of course we're biased, is that the SMR technology has been around for 30 years. They've been used in nuclear submarines. Nuclear powered submarines is really an SMR. And by the way, putting an SMR into something on land is a hell of a lot easier than putting it onto a submarine. Those of you that watch that BBC program, Vigil, submarines are nothing like that. They're about 1/10 of the size. There is no room to move for anyone. And putting a nuclear reactor into a submarine is much more challenging than putting on land. So the technology is there. And one of the advantages, it's a proven technology and it's safe, it's certified safe. I suspect the biggest issues with SMRs, as with large nuclear, will be the civil engineering, building the plants. It won't be the nuclear engineering, and also getting public acceptance. I mean, I'm really happy to hear Rachel say, and I'm hearing younger people are embracing nuclear, but nuclear is one of those difficult words like diesel or profit. It raises strong emotions, and in parts of the world, Germany, Eastern Europe, it raises very strong emotions. So I suspect the biggest challenges to the adoption of nuclear will be civic society, social attitudes, as well as engineering. So everybody likes the idea of a small modular at the moment, but not if it's going to be near their house. So I think we're going to have to deal with that. And I think we will. I think we can demonstrate it, but that's where I think the real bottleneck will be. There are new nuclear technologies coming along. Our view is that will take a long time, again, for safety certification. So I hope that's, I probably said more than I should already, but I could spend half an hour talking about that.
Very much indeed, very, very interesting.
Thank you, Ian, again on that. I'd like to call on Tarquin Henderson, if we can spotlight and unmute Tarquin. Tarquin's our new head of ESG engagement. Tarquin, over to you. And if we have time, perhaps we can go on to John Chandler and Khalid Aziz. Tarquin.
Apologies to Laura just going by. I'd just be interested in Rachel and Ian's view on the role of business and acting as a catalyst for positive behaviour change amongst consumers. we hear a lot about, certainly COP26 is very much focused on, country, nation scale change, but really, ultimately we will win this battle by getting people to change their behaviours, their lifestyle patterns, and that's the responsibility not just of government but of businesses as well. I just wonder whether that's something that you debated within Rolls-Royce, and if so, what's your approach to that? Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps I make a start and then Ian can chip in. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Actually, as a B2B company, it's perhaps not something we've been thinking about for all that long, but I think we've certainly seen throughout the last 18 months the need to focus more clearly on society as a ultimate customer of our power solutions. It's taken a bit of a shift in how we think as a business to really consider that. But I think as we've heard, we're increasingly seeing society calling for net and lower carbon solutions. And just before the pandemic in aviation, certainly we're just seeing the first shoots of the flight shame movement in Scandinavia as an example of that. I think it comes back to the conversation that Ian and I were having before around prioritization, and basically transparency and informed decision making. And individuals or collectives will make decisions based on what they prioritize in their lifestyles. And some people will choose not to fly, and others will choose to continue flying. I think for us as an industry, we are trying to promote the sort of socioeconomic benefits of what we do, and considering, to Ian's point earlier, the focus on adaptation and resilience and making sure that the transition is a just one. And particularly one thing we're very conscious of is things like electrification of flight could potentially really democratize, really struggle with that word, connecting communities in a way that they've never been able to connect before. So we need to think kind of radically, I think, and think a bigger picture when we're looking at this journey that we're all on.
Yeah, I think very well said. And I think, Tarquin, it's a good point. I don't think we've thought enough about it. We've said we're a B2B company, but actually that's probably not good enough, because consumers are the ones who in the end pay for everything that we do. And it's a complicated, I think we are only beginning. We're perhaps a bit slow on it, but we've got the B2B mindset. We have to think about the consumers, and we are working with the airlines, are very, very interested on this. So maybe, transparency on flights, consumers should know how much CO2 is being it varies from flight to flight, but giving consumers information is important. Maybe we could have an Intel type strategy, Rolls-Royce inside. You're flying on an engine, which, these are things I think we started thinking about as a company, but we need to work very carefully with our customers who are in aerospace, the airlines, in power centers, and that it's probably easier to do. But I think this is all part of the transparency debate. And my instinct is, I think, Tarquin, you're onto a really big point here, is we need to go further down, particularly when you get to Asia. Remember, 9%, only 9% of the world's population has ever been on a plane. And in Asia, the aspirational thing is to go on holiday abroad. That is the absolute aspiration, to go from China to Dubai or somewhere. So is that group going to put that more above environmental impact? Don't know, but we should be thinking about that and probably spending more time and energy on it. That's been very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both. Final question, if we can go over, I think we've got John Chandler and then perhaps Fahmid, unless Khalid has the question. John?
Yeah, thank you. Great insights. It's actually the flip side of Tarquin's question, looking the other way up the value chain towards your suppliers. And of course you do, obviously being a massive procurement business. What are you doing in relation to driving change through the value chain where you can influence, and obviously where products and services are being built for you on your behalf? And obviously you can affect an awful lot of change throughout different industries to make that happen.
Yeah, well, it's a great point. And I think too often people don't focus on supply chain, particularly upstream from them. They focus on customers and narrow customers. And I think it's and that's one thing. Another thing we've learned from the COVID vaccine crisis, a lot of the ideas came actually from up the supply chain, not from there. To me, I think your question really gives the answer, is involving the supply chain in what you're trying to do is really helpful. For example, I know at Rolls-Royce, we had a supplier conference, which was focused on exactly this topic and asking them for ideas. So for example, if you can make materials lighter or new, just a very small example, it has a big impact on energy consumption. So involving, I talked about academia, but suppliers to me are a big source of technology, often the biggest source of innovative technology. It's amazing when you talk to supplier, they say something, they say, why haven't you done this? And I said, why didn't you suggest it to us earlier? But you'll probably get from the way I'm talking, I'm a huge believer in open collaborative systems for innovation. I think any innovation itself, it needs to involve everyone, your employees, your customers, government, and all the rest of it. And I think your question about involving the supply chain is absolutely crucial. Not just giving them the history of the aerospace industry, less so install power, is to give your suppliers the spec, make this. We need to say, this is what we're trying to do with this. How would you do it? This is how we're thinking of doing it. Can we do it lighter? Light is always good, by the way, in aerospace. Durable is always good. So I think this collaboration mindset, which doesn't easily go in the heavy industry engineering. It's a quite old school, macho, often male environment. We need to change that. Rachel and I have talked about that at length. We need, you talked about Gen Z. We need Gen Z, not are they going to be a problem? They're part of the solution. And by the way, Gen Z can be 55 years old as well as 25 years old. I know it's an important point. I don't like this crude simplification or segmentation of people's attitudes. It's not helpful.
Right. I'm delighted to be Gen Z now again. That's very exciting. Thank you. Thank you, Ian, for that. We've touched on so much. I know there are other questions. Forgive me. I think we have come to the end of our time, but the power of collaboration, clearly the power of listening. I think that's also what we're really hearing is the importance of listening and doing this together is just being so impressive and so insightful to hear both of you on this. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your contribution, for your expertise and your guidance. And I hope you can stay with us for the rest of our session.